Racist judge sentences black mother to life in prison, unaware her husband is the mayor. The Westbrook County Courthouse stood imposing and cold as Sarah Thompson entered her steps, measured and dignified despite the anxiety churning inside her. At 42, Sarah had built a life defined by service, a respected nurse at East Westbrook Medical Center community volunteer, and devoted mother to 16-year-old twins. Her arrest 3 months ago had shocked everyone who knew her. The charge seemed absurd: possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute. The controlled substance was her elderly mother's heart medication, which Sarah had transferred to a smaller bottle during a weekend visit. A routine traffic stop for a broken taillight had escalated when the officer spotted the unlabeled pills. Sarah's public defender, Mark Daniels, leaned over. "Remember what we discussed. Plead guilty to the lesser charge. With your clean record, we're looking at probation, maybe a fine." Sarah nodded reluctantly. She hadn't done anything wrong, but she had the twins to think about and her mother who needed care. She couldn't risk a lengthy trial. What no one in the courtroom knew was that in the back row, a man had quietly entered and taken a seat. James Mitchell, Westbrook City's first black mayor, had canceled his morning meetings to be present, not in his official capacity, but as Sarah Thompson's husband of 18 years. Their marriage wasn't a secret exactly, but it was private. Sarah kept her maiden name, professionally wanting to succeed on her own merit rather than as the mayor's wife. They lived in a modest home in a middle-class neighborhood, not the mayoral residence. Judge William Harrison entered the courtroom, his wire-rimmed glasses and thinning white hair giving him a scholarly appearance that belied the prejudice that often influenced his rulings, particularly for defendants from the predominantly black east side of Westbrook. Case number 2023 CR 478, State versus Sarah Thompson, the clerk announced. "Ms. Thompson, I understand you wish to change your plea." Judge Harrison peered over his glasses. "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "I am pleading guilty to the lesser charge of possession of a controlled substance." The judge nodded. "Very well. We'll proceed to sentencing." In the back row, James Mitchell tensed. This wasn't right. The plea agreement called for a separate sentencing hearing, not an immediate decision. As the prosecutor outlined the case against Sarah with embellishments that painted her as calculating rather than caring, James saw his wife's shoulders stiffen. She was realizing too late that the system she had trusted to be fair was anything but. "Your Honor," Daniels concluded his defense, "Ms. Thompson has no prior record. She's a registered nurse who was simply carrying her mother's medication. We ask for probation." Judge Harrison removed his glasses, a warning sign to those familiar with his courtroom. "Ms. Thompson, you have pled guilty to a serious offense. As a nurse, you should know better than anyone the dangers of prescription drug abuse in our community. The court has a responsibility to send a message," he continued, "that no one, regardless of their position or background, is above the law." The courtroom fell silent, a collective breath held as everyone sensed what was coming. "Sarah Thompson, I hereby sentence you to 25 years to life in state prison." The courtroom erupted. Mark Daniels jumped to his feet, objecting vehemently. Sarah stood frozen, unable to process the words she had just heard. And in the back row, Mayor James Mitchell rose slowly, his decision made. The life they had carefully built, the boundaries between public and private, no longer mattered. What mattered now was justice, and he would use every ounce of his power to ensure his wife received it. Your Honor, Mark Daniels' voice cut through the chaos. This sentence is grossly disproportionate. We request an immediate stay pending appeal. Judge Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly. Order, the sentence stands. As court officers moved toward Sarah, a commanding voice rang out from the back of the courtroom. Stop these proceedings immediately. All heads turned to see Mayor James Mitchell striding down the center aisle. Judge Harrison's face registered first confusion, then annoyance. Mayor Mitchell, this is my courtroom. Whatever business you have can wait until... This is my wife you're sentencing, Judge Harrison. James stated, his voice steady, but charged with emotion. And what I just witnessed was not justice. It was prejudice, cloaked in judicial authority. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Judge Harrison's face flushed red. The prosecutor looked between the mayor and Sarah, connecting dots that had never been presented to the court. Your Honor, the prosecutor began cautiously, if there's a relationship between the defendant and Mayor Mitchell, perhaps we should recess to consider. My marital status is irrelevant to these proceedings. Sarah spoke up. I didn't mention it because I wanted to be treated like any other citizen. Her gaze fixed on Judge Harrison. Though it appears any other citizen who looks like me receives a very different kind of justice in your courtroom. What's contemptuous, James added, now standing beside Sarah, is a 25-year sentence for carrying medication for an elderly parent, a sentence that defies all precedent and proportion. The mayor turned to address the packed courtroom, many already recording on their phones. For those wondering, yes, Sarah Thompson is my wife. We maintain separate professional identities by mutual choice. But make no mistake, what happened here today is not about who she's married to. It's about who she is, a black woman from East Westbrook facing a judge with a documented history of disparate sentencing. Judge Harrison banged his gavel again. Mayor Mitchell, you're out of order. Bailiff, clear the court. As the bailiff moved uncertainly toward the mayor, James reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. Before anyone does anything they might regret, I should mention that I've just texted the State Attorney General, the Judicial Conduct Board, and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. They'll all be very interested in reviewing today's proceedings. Judge Harrison's expression shifted from anger to caution. This court will recess for 1 hour, he announced abruptly, rising from the bench and retreating to his chambers. In the momentary lull, Sarah turned to James. 25 years, she whispered, for Mom's heart pills. James embraced her. It's not going to happen, he promised. Not one day of that sentence will stand. As they prepared to face the waiting press outside, Sarah straightened her shoulders. Those boundaries were a luxury, weren't they? One that most people who look like us don't have. She took his hand. I'm ready, not just for me, but for everyone who stood where I stood today without a mayor for a husband. Together, they walked out to face the waiting cameras, united in purpose, if not yet certain of success. What had begun as a personal injustice was about to become a very public reckoning. By evening, the story had exploded across media nationwide. Mayor's wife sentenced to life for carrying mother's medication dominated headlines, accompanied by courtroom photos capturing Judge Harrison's contemptuous expression and Sarah's dignified shock. The mayor's office had transformed into a command center. James's chief of staff, Alicia Washington, coordinated with legal experts while his communications director fielded relentless media inquiries. The state attorney general's office called, Alicia reported. They're sending someone to review the case personally, and the Judicial Conduct Board has opened an investigation into Harrison's sentencing patterns. James nodded, unsurprised. Judge Harrison had reconvened court only to announce a stay of sentencing pending review, his earlier bravado replaced by terse efficiency. Sarah had been released on her own recognizance, the prosecutor suddenly amenable to conditions he had opposed that morning. "What about the DOJ?" James asked. "Still waiting, but Congressman Lewis called. He's spoken directly to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. They're interested." Sarah looked up from the legal brief she'd been reading. "All of this attention because of who I'm married to," she observed, her tone mixed with gratitude and frustration. "What about everyone else Harrison has sentenced unfairly?" "That's exactly what we're going to find out," said Diana Chen, a data journalist whose investigative reporting on racial disparities in criminal justice had earned her a Pulitzer. James had reached out to her immediately after the courtroom confrontation. Over the next hour, Chen outlined her preliminary findings. The disparities were stark. Black defendants in Judge Harrison's courtroom received sentences averaging 40% longer than white defendants for equivalent crimes, even when controlling for prior records. For drug offenses specifically, the gap widened to 65%. "And that's just what I could access without the full records," Chen concluded. "With complete data, I suspect we'll find even more significant patterns." Across town, Judge William Harrison sat alone in his home study, a glass of bourbon in his hand and CNN playing on mute. His face appeared on screen periodically alongside images of Sarah and James. 30 years on the bench, a reputation for being tough but fair in his own estimation, and now this trial by media, his judgment questioned. The phone rang. His brother-in-law, Stanley Whitmore, Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. "Will," the Chief Justice began without preamble, "tell me you didn't know she was the mayor's wife." "Of course I didn't know," Harrison snapped. "She used her maiden name. There was nothing in the file." "And the sentence 25 years for prescription pills in the wrong bottle. Even for you, that's extreme?" Harrison bristled. "The law allows for it. She's a nurse, Stan. She should be held to a higher standard." "The Judicial Conduct Board has requested all your sentencing records for the past 5 years. I can't interfere with that, and frankly, I'm not inclined to try." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you should consider your options carefully. Retirement might be the most dignified path forward." After the call ended, Harrison sat in the darkening room. Retirement. A quiet exit. The suggestion stung his pride, but a deeper fear was taking root. What if they really did analyze all his sentencing decisions? That night, Channel 7's 11 o'clock news led with an exclusive 3 former clerks from Judge Harrison's court. Their identities concealed, describing a pattern of explicit bias in his chambers. He would look at the docket each morning and make comments about the East Side specials. One clerk revealed, if a defendant was black, especially from certain neighborhoods, he'd say things like, "Let's make an example," or "Another one who needs to learn respect for the law." The story sent shock waves through Westbrook. By morning, protesters had gathered outside the courthouse carrying signs that read, "Justice for Sarah" and "Investigate Harrison now." 3 days after Sarah's sentencing, the Judicial Conduct Board, announced a formal investigation into Judge Harrison's entire judicial record. Simultaneously, the State Attorney General's office appointed a special prosecutor to review Sarah's case and similar sentences handed down by Harrison. The judge himself had gone silent, canceling his docket and refusing all interview requests. Sources close to him claimed he was consulting with attorneys about his options. For Sarah and James, the personal toll was mounting. Their twins, Michael and Mia, had been thrust into the spotlight, their school surrounded by reporters. The family had temporarily moved into the mayoral residence for security and privacy. "I never wanted this for them," Sarah said as she watched the news coverage with James in their temporary home. "They shouldn't have to see their mother portrayed as a criminal." "They're seeing something else too," James replied gently. "They're seeing us fight injustice. They're learning that sometimes you have to stand up even when it's hard." The conversation was interrupted by Alicia rushing in with breaking news. "Judge Harrison just held a press conference. He's claiming political persecution and saying the mayor is using his influence to overturn a legitimate sentence." They watched in disbelief as Harrison, looking haggard but defiant, addressed the cameras outside his home. "This witch hunt is nothing more than political retaliation by Mayor Mitchell for doing my job," Harrison declared. Ms. Thompson broke the law, admitted her guilt, and received a sentence within statutory guidelines. The fact that she's married to the mayor doesn't place her above the law. "He's trying to make this about us," Sarah said quietly, "about you using your position." James nodded, his expression grim. "It's a classic deflection strategy. Make it about politics rather than justice." The crisis deepened the following day when a group of judges from the county issued a statement supporting Harrison's judicial independence and warning against political interference in the courts. Though carefully worded to avoid directly addressing Sarah's case, the implication was clear: the judicial establishment was closing ranks. That evening, as James and Sarah met with their expanding legal and strategy team, they received unexpected news. Tanya Williams, a woman who had served 6 years of a 10-year sentence from Judge Harrison for a nearly identical offense, wanted to speak publicly about her experience. She was carrying her son's asthma medication in an unmarked container. Eliza Washington, the civil rights attorney who had joined their team, explained, "Harrison gave her 10 years. She's been out on parole for 2 years now." "The difference," Diana Chin added, "she's also black, also from East Westbrook, but she wasn't married to anyone with power." The decision to include Tanya in their strategy wasn't easy. James worried about appearing to politicize another woman's trauma, while Sarah feared backlash against someone already victimized by the system. But Tanya herself was resolute. "I spent 6 years away from my son because of that man," she told him when they met. "If my story helps expose him and prevents even one more mother from going through what I did, it's worth whatever comes my way." The press conference they organized the next day changed the narrative dramatically. Standing beside Sarah, Tanya Williams told her story with quiet dignity, how a routine traffic stop had led to her arrest, how Judge Harrison had dismissed her explanation about her son's medication, how she had missed 6 years of her child's life. "The only difference between me and Sarah Thompson," Tanya concluded, "is that Sarah has a husband with the power to fight back. I had no one. How many others like me are sitting in prison right now because of Judge Harrison's justice? The impact was immediate and powerful. More former defendants came forward with similar stories. Community organizations began compiling data on Harrison's sentencing disparities. The hashtag #OurHarrisonJustice trended nationally, with people sharing stories of racial disparities in their own local courts. Judge Harrison, watching his carefully constructed reputation crumble, made a fatal miscalculation. In an interview with a sympathetic local radio host, he lashed out. "This is what happens when we let emotions override the law," he said. "These people from the East Side want special treatment. They commit crimes, then cry racism when they face consequences. These people." The phrase, with its unmistakable racial connotation, was the final nail in Harrison's judicial coffin. By evening, even his supporters in the judiciary had distanced themselves. The Chief Justice issued a statement reaffirming the court system's commitment to equal justice regardless of race, background, or neighborhood. 1 week after Sarah's sentencing, the special prosecutor appointed by the Attorney General announced his findings. Sarah's sentence was grossly disproportionate, legally unsupportable, and recommended for immediate vacatur. Furthermore, he recommended a comprehensive review of all of Judge Harrison's sentencing decisions over the past decade. The Judicial Conduct Board, moving with unprecedented speed, scheduled an emergency hearing to consider temporary suspension of Judge Harrison, pending their full investigation. For Sarah and James, these developments brought cautious optimism, but they knew the fight was far from over. Harrison still had supporters, particularly among those who viewed the mayor's involvement as political overreach. And the broader issues of systemic bias in the courts wouldn't be solved by one judge's downfall. "We need to think beyond my case," Sarah insisted during a strategy session. "This has to be about reform, not just retribution." James agreed. They began working with state legislators on a judicial accountability bill that would require regular analysis of sentencing patterns and establish an independent review process for complaints of bias. The night before the Judicial Conduct Board hearing, Harrison made one last desperate attempt to salvage his career. He requested a private meeting with James without attorneys present. "It's a trap," Alicia warned. "He'll claim you threatened him or offered a deal." James considered this. "You're probably right. But what if it's an opportunity to resolve this without more damage to the judicial system itself?" After careful deliberation, James agreed to meet Harrison, but with conditions. The meeting would take place in a neutral location with security cameras. While no attorneys would be present in the room, both Sarah and their legal team would be in an adjacent space, able to observe through a one-way mirror. That evening, in a conference room at the Westbrook Public Library, Mayor James Mitchell came face to face with Judge William Harrison. The judge looked diminished, somehow his customary judicial confidence replaced by a nervous energy. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Harrison began, his voice lacking its usual courtroom authority. "I'm listening," James replied simply, his expression neutral. Harrison cleared his throat. "This situation has escalated beyond what anyone intended. I want to propose a resolution that serves everyone's interests. I'm not here to negotiate my wife's freedom, Judge Harrison. Justice isn't a bargaining chip." "Of course not," Harrison said quickly. "I'm prepared to vacate the sentence immediately. Ms. Thompson, your wife would face no further charges. The case would be dismissed." James studied the man across from him. "And what would you expect in return?" "Your public statement that this was a legal misunderstanding, not bias. Your support in ending the Judicial Conduct Board's investigation." Harrison leaned forward. "Mayor Mitchell, we both know how these investigations can damage public faith in our institutions. Is that really in the city's best interest?" James allowed a moment of silence before responding. "Judge Harrison, let me be clear. I'm not here as a politician looking for a deal. I'm here as a husband whose wife faced injustice and as a mayor who has sworn to uphold equal justice for all citizens." He stood, signaling the meeting's end. "There will be no statement exonerating you. There will be no interference with the investigation. What happens next is what should have happened from the beginning, a fair and impartial review of your conduct on the bench." Harrison's face hardened. "You're making a mistake. I have friends in this system, supporters who are abandoning you one by one as your true record comes to light." James interrupted. "Good evening, Judge Harrison." As James turned to leave, Harrison called after him, "You know I never had anything against your wife personally. It was just the law." James paused at the door. "No, Judge Harrison, it was never about the law. It was about who you saw when my wife stood before you, not a nurse, not a mother, not even a first-time defendant. You saw a black woman from East Westbrook, and you decided she needed to be made an example of." He met Harrison's gaze directly. "That's not law. That's prejudice." The next morning, the Judicial Conduct Board convened its emergency hearing. The room was packed with media, legal observers, and community members. Sarah and James sat in the front row, flanked by their legal team and supporters. Judge Harrison arrived with his attorneys, his expression grim but composed. As the hearing began, the board's chairperson outlined the unprecedented nature of the proceedings and the seriousness of the allegations. Just as the first witness was about to be called, Harrison's lead attorney requested permission to address the board. What followed stunned the room into silence. In light of recent developments and after careful consideration, Judge William Harrison has decided to tender his immediate resignation from the bench. He acknowledges that certain sentencing decisions, including that of Sarah Thompson, may have created an appearance of impropriety that undermines public confidence in the judiciary. Murmurs rippled through the audience as the attorney continued. Judge Harrison maintains that his rulings were based on his interpretation of the law, not bias. However, he recognizes that the controversy surrounding this case has made it impossible for him to continue serving effectively. He therefore steps down in the interest of preserving the dignity of the court. The board chairperson, visibly surprised, conferred briefly with other members before responding. The board acknowledges Judge Harrison's resignation. However, this does not automatically terminate our investigation into patterns of potentially biased sentencing. That investigation will continue. Outside the hearing room, reporters swarmed James and Sarah for comment. With cameras rolling, Sarah stepped forward. "Today isn't about victory or vindication for me personally," she said, her voice steady. "It's about acknowledging that justice must be truly blind, not to our differences, but to prejudice. Judge Harrison's resignation is just one step toward the systemic change our courts need." James stood beside her, adding, "This case has exposed uncomfortable truths about disparities in our justice system. Now the real work begins ensuring that what happened to my wife, to Tanya Williams, and to countless others doesn't continue happening simply because most victims don't have the resources or platform to fight back. 3 months later, Sarah stood at a podium in East Westbrook Community Center, addressing a packed room of community members, activists, and officials. Behind her, a banner proclaimed, "Justice Reform Initiative, equal justice, equal dignity." When I was wrongfully sentenced to 25 years in prison for carrying my mother's heart medication, I experienced firsthand what many in our community have faced for generations. She began. The difference was that I had resources and connections many don't have. That inequality of justice ends today. The audience applauded as Sarah unveiled the initiative she had developed with community leaders, legal experts, and those directly impacted by judicial bias. The comprehensive program included a sentencing review board to examine cases of potential judicial bias or disproportionate sentences, mandatory data collection, and annual audits of sentencing patterns across demographic groups, community oversight committees with real power to investigate complaints, legal aid resources specifically for those challenging, potentially biased sentences. The state legislature had already passed the Thompson Judicial Accountability Act, requiring judges to undergo implicit bias training and establishing clear guidelines for sentencing consistency. In the audience, Tanya Williams sat with her now teenage son, tears streaming down her face as Sarah acknowledged her courage in coming forward. Beside them were 5 other individuals whose sentences under Judge Harrison had been reviewed and commuted following the investigation. Mayor James Mitchell joined his wife at the podium for the closing remarks. What began as a personal injustice has become a movement for change, he said. But let's be clear, this isn't about one bad judge. This is about building systems that deliver justice equally, regardless of race, wealth, or status. As the formal program ended and people mingled, Sarah found herself face to face with an elderly white woman she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Mitchell," the woman said hesitantly, "I'm Elizabeth Harrison Williams' wife." Sarah tensed, slightly unsure what to expect. "I wanted to tell you, I'm sorry for what my husband did to you, to that Williams woman, to all of them." Her voice trembled. "William isn't an evil man, but he carried prejudices he never acknowledged even to himself. What happened has forced him to face truths he spent a lifetime avoiding." Sarah nodded, moved by the woman's sincerity. "Thank you for telling me this. Acknowledging the problem is the first step toward healing." "He's volunteering at a legal clinic now," Elizabeth added, "helping people understand their rights. It's a small thing, but it's a beginning," Sarah finished for her. Later that evening, as Sarah and James walked home to their family residence, they had moved back from the mayoral mansion. Once the media attention subsided, Sarah reflected on the journey of the past months. "When I stood in that courtroom and heard 25 years to life, I thought my world had ended," she said. "I never imagined it would lead to all this." James squeezed her hand. "You turned an injustice into a catalyst for change. That's who you've always been." Sarah smiled, but her expression remained thoughtful. "The work is just beginning. For every case like mine that makes headlines, there are hundreds that don't. And now there's a system being built to find them," James reminded her. "Not perfect, but better." As they reached their front porch, Sarah paused, looking back at the city skyline in the distance. "You know what still bothers me sometimes? If Harrison had known I was the mayor's wife that day in court, none of this would have happened. He would have given me probation, smiled, and moved on to the next case. And Tanya Williams would still be just another statistic, James added, and those 5 others would still be serving unjust sentences. Sarah nodded. Sometimes justice takes strange paths. They entered their home, greeted by the twins calling from the kitchen where they were attempting to prepare dinner. Life had found a new normal one where Sarah's experience had transformed not just their family, but an entire system. In his former chambers, now occupied by Judge Amara Johnson, the first Black woman appointed to the Westbrook County Court, a framed quote hung on the wall, "Justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are." Benjamin Franklin. Below it, in smaller text, was an addition, "The Thompson Case, Westbrook County, 2023." A reminder.